So welcome along to another edition of Super 7, a show where we ask a current or former rider to give us their ultimate dream team, their 1 to 7, their Super 7. My name is John McGilvery.
And I am Liam Rudden, and we're breaking the rules a little bit this week because we have a very special guest, and he's not a rider, and he's not a former rider, and he's not a current rider, but this man has seen more, I suppose, matches than John and I put together, or probably ever will. He's a bit of a legend of the sport in his own right, and I'll let John introduce him to you.
Yeah, thanks, Liam. We've definitely gone rogue this week. We've stepped away from the riders, but for a very good reason. I'm delighted to welcome along to Super 7, Peter Oakes. Peter, thank you for joining us.
Well, I'm delighted to be with you boys. I've watched a few of the series, and yeah, it's really enjoyable. So hopefully we can have a little bit of enjoyment and a little bit of fun.
It's always nice to meet a fan, Liam, isn't it?
Yeah, it is indeed. It is. Peter, tell me, I mean, there doesn't seem to be anything in Speedway that you have not done, and other than race the bikes. And at the moment, of course, everybody knows you from the Speedway Star, which you've been a faithful servant of for years and years. Talk to us about how you got interested in the sport. How did it all start when you were a boy?
As far as I can remember, and I have to say, first of all, Liam, I haven't got the best of memories. That a lot of people think, oh, you're bound to have memories of everything, and I haven't, because my memory isn't good. But what I do usually know is where I can find out. As far as I'm aware, I probably went, I would think it would have been about 1957 to Liverpool. I was born in Liverpool, I was brought up in Liverpool. I lived relatively close to the old Liverpool track, which was in Prescott Road in Fairfield. That all that separated where I lived and the track was a park, and a huge park called Shield Park. And I walked across there, as far as I can remember. I walked across the park straight into the stadium. It was probably maybe a half-hour walk, but I don't really know how I first of all got interested. I had family connections with the sport, but all I really recall of my first experience was that the Liverpool track was a quarter of a mile. It was a great big track. To a young kid of maybe 12, it looked absolutely huge, but it used to have a brick wall. There was a greyhound track, and outside the greyhound track was a brick wall which had tiles on the top of it. And I can vividly remember this brick wall with the tiles. And I think I can remember various incidents from meetings there, but I can't be absolutely certain. Sometimes your memory does play tricks on you, but I'm fairly sure that, like, amongst the early things I can remember, there used to be a rider who was in the second half at Liverpool called Tommy Murphy, who, to say that he wasn't a good rider is probably overestimating. He was an awful rider. I can remember again, the program had in, on one occasion, a little illustration of a track, and you had to put an X to mark the spot where Tommy Murphy would fall off. It was Speedway's equivalent to Spot the Ball. You say next, where's Tommy going to fall off next week? I can also remember, where memories are when you were a kid, that you think that you remember it, and I think you probably do, because you can't make it up. And I can remember that he came out on one occasion with rockets fixed to his bike. Literally the traditional bonfire night rockets, and he had these two rockets either side. Got out on the bike, great big flurry of, I suppose it would be, light and sparkle, and he went round on this. Inevitably he probably fell off that night. That's the first thing. I suppose it's the sort of thing that does stick in your mind. I remember that more than the riders who were competing, because I don't even think he ever rode for Liverpool, but he was a great second half entertainer. You couldn't imagine it happening today, but it did. And I think that it may even have been before 57, but I'm not absolutely certain.
And you say you can't imagine that happening today. You certainly couldn't imagine a brick wall around the track today, could you?
Oh no, there was. If the brick wall was around the Greyhound track, and
the fans.
Speedway track, I'm fairly certain, was inside the Greyhound track. So it wasn't as if it was a brick wall. Although you say that, like as recently as the late 60s, there was a concrete wall at Romford. And they never did anything other than race around there with the concrete wall being the safety fence. And that is, well, I don't know, I say it's relatively recent. It's, 50 odd years ago, isn't it? But it is our modern era. It was in the 60s after the formation of the second division in 1968. So you're talking of 50 years, but that was literally a concrete wall, and it was around a football pitch, and they never had to do anything at all about the fence. Fence was there. You ask any rider, if you did interview any riders that were racing in the late 60s and raced at Romford, they will tell you about it.
You mentioned it was Liverpool was the first place that you went to see Speedway. Now, I don't have a memory of there being a team in Liverpool. I don't know when the last time. You'll be able to tell us, I'm sure there was a team in Liverpool. How much of a loss is that to the sport for you? Certainly, that there isn't a kind of hometown team, especially in a city the size of Liverpool.
Yeah, the last time was 1960. They raced in the inaugural Provincial League in 1960. They closed down at the end of 1960, which are another story I can tell later on 1960. I think it's a terrible, terrible shame because, city at size of Liverpool should have been able to support a speedway track. The stadium was demolished to make way for a fruit and vegetable wholesale market, basically, where all the greengrocers from Liverpool would go to get their fruit for their shops. Strange enough, I was actually up there sometime, probably now it'd be 2019 or maybe 2020, when the lockdown wasn't in, and the market, or the wholesalers, the market has now closed down. So you've still got the gates of what was probably the old Speedway gates going in. But just a shame, because at Ellesmere Port, I think when that opened, they hoped that would attract people from Liverpool, but it didn't really, because it's the other side of the River Mersey, and very much you don't get people from Liverpool going out to Ellesmere Port, which is a smallish town. Well, certainly in comparison. But there was an attempt at one stage to try and get permission to run a track at a place called Kirby, which again is a district of Liverpool, but much nearer housing and much nearer the centre. But there was stock car racing there, but they never got round to Speedway, which was always a shame. But even now, if you're going to open somewhere, I would have thought Liverpool might have been a possibility, but it's tradition. There's been no Speedway there for 60 years, so I think it would be a lot harder than opening, say, you went back to to Workington or places that have closed more recently. But it's one of the biggest cities, isn't it, that hasn't had Speedway over the years. Along with places like Southampton and Bristol, even. It's just a tragedy that all for the sport, that all these big cities don't have Speedway there, because we've got to really get into big cities to be recognised.
And I suppose the irony, Peter, was that as Liverpool closed in 1960, that's when many other cities were refinding the sport and rediscovering it with the Provincial League.
Yeah, very much so. That Liverpool ran pirate meetings in '59 under Mike Parker, who was basically the driving force behind the launch and the introduction of the Provincial League. His original idea was to be a league for juniors, but the southern tracks began tempting the ex-riders out of retirement, so that you suddenly found Liverpool, who started off the season with all juniors, with one exception, which was Peter Craven's elder brother, Brian. and Bradford were the other team up in the north who went along the junior route, but the southern teams suddenly had, Trevor Redmond riding, Ken Middleditch riding, and some big names from the 50s, and Liverpool and Bradford barely won a meeting all season except when they were against each other. Crowds dropped off in Liverpool. I think Liverpool is such a football orientated city that you would have to have a team that was successful to attract people. But there are other reasons Liverpool closed, but I think that the team was the major reason. It was a poor team, and I think Liverpool won 4 matches all season. I think Bradford won 1 or 2 maybe all season. It's the way it goes.
Anyway, we'll start on your Super 7, Peter. We've got a few names in there that I didn't recognise, but I'm desperate to hear the stories behind them. What was your thoughts putting your Super 7 together?
It was poorly Jarton that if you just said pick your best team, then that is easy, isn't it? You start off with Tony Ricardson, you work your way through world champions, and you have a team of 7 world champions, because that is the ultimate team to win things. But what I've done is people who actually meant something to me for one reason or another, and weren't like, this team wouldn't win, against some of your Super 7 teams, wouldn't have a chance. It would put up a decent showing, but some of the riders certainly, I don't think anyone else in this country would choose some of the riders that I've picked, but they've all got a personal reason. It's rather like, when you're asked, if you're ever asked to go on Desert Island Discs, you pick songs and records that mean something to you. And in one way or another, all these riders have played a part in my life.
That's exactly what we're looking for, Liam, isn't it? That's where we want this tailored to the individual person. It's exactly what we're looking for.
Yeah, and absolutely. Everyone has a reason, and they were important to me at different stages of my life.
Brilliant. Well, let's get on with it then. Let's start with your number 1. Now, he's a new name to me, but I'm guessing because he was signed by Liverpool, he means quite a bit to you in your early years of watching the Speedway. So who have you got then at number 1?
Well, the first one is Reg Duval. Now, most people will be saying, who? Never heard of him. Who on earth was he? That Reg was a decent enough rider that... but the reason that I've picked him is because he was the first rider I ever interviewed face to face at his home. That Reg rode for Liverpool in the 50s. He opened Liverpool after it had closed down as a promoter in 1955. It was probably me talking about when I think I first went, it was probably when Reg was the promoter. He ran a series of open meetings. He was forced to close down because the league promoters, got upset that he was using top riders. He used people like Peter Craven and all the other riders of that era for these open meetings. He called the team the Liverpool Eagles at the time. But I'm not really sure how it came about, but I think I probably must have seen Reg for the first time and met him properly at the 1960 Provincial League Riders Championship final. He was riding for Bradford. He'd ridden in the first division for a few years, at Oxford in particular, but had dropped down into the Provincial League when they opened. In 1962, I was working at a local freelance agency in, I think it was the one in St. Helens, and I went to in August, I sent off, sat down, typed away a little piece, which I sent to the Speedway Star. And the first piece that ever went in the Speedway Star by myself appeared in August, just a couple of weeks after my 18th birthday. So it was actually August the 18th. And it was called a Speed Tale. And it said by Pete, of all words, Oakes. It didn't say Pete, it was by Pete Oakes, and it was about Soren Sejoston. So, as a sort of young, keen, journalist, I carried off sending a few different pieces to them, all speed tales, which were basically done from research. Early on, I'm trying to think who I did. Ken McKinley, I did, Ken Adams, Peter Moore. And then I went to the Provincial League Riders Championship final at Bellevue and actually spoke to Reg Duval and arranged with him to go and interview him at his home. It was in Liverpool, so it wasn't far for me to go off and see him. I went in, he was regally entertained by him and his wife, who was a Scouser as well. So even though Reg was born in London, I presume that he met his wife at Liverpool. They got married, had a little one. So for me, that was the first real face-to-face interview I ever did for Speedway Star. So Reg Duval, who'd been the promoter, had been a rider at Liverpool. It was really a fitting start. And after that piece appeared in October, and really, except for a short spell, I've been writing for Speedway Star ever since. But it's intriguing just to look back and to see how a feature has changed, because before Reg Duval, none of the features actually contained quotes from the riders. It was all about their background, where they started, etc., etc. And when you look at it now, and words are the most, quotes are the most important thing, what a rider is saying. But Reg for me was the first one, and it's you never forget that. I'm sure Liam will tell you, you don't forget the first person you go and interview in a sport, or in Liam's case, in a sport, or in show business. I think that always remains with you. Like you always remember, I still remember the first feature I ever wrote for my local newspaper, which was when I was 16. Those sort of things stay with you. So Reg Duval, who is still alive, he lives down on the south coast. He's 93 now. We probably speak, I've spoken to him a few times since, probably 4 or 5 years ago. But that is a nice little memory, and that's why he's the first person, in my Super 7. He was super for
Liam,
me.
who was your first interviewer? You'd be giving your age away here.
My first interview was actually a DJ, a radio presenter called Tom Bell, when I was 15. And it's true what you say though, Peter, you do remember those first interviews. And it's funny, I'm just thinking here that even now today, I still get a thrill out of interviewing Speedway riders from the past. And over the recent couple of years, I've had some great chances to track down many of the monarchs of the 50s and the 60s. And although I never saw them racing, there's actually still something really special about talking to them and getting their memories. And now I know that I follow in your footsteps as the first man to actually get quotes from Speedway riders to put into interviews. So that makes me feel good. And the man you've got at number 2 in your team has done many, many interviews, and I'm sure you have interviewed him many times. He became a great friend of yours, and I'm dying to find out if you know why his nickname was Sprouts. Can you tell us who you have at number 2?
Yeah, of course, it's Ivan Major. That someone who, as you say, was and his family still are great personal friends. And Sprouts, it has always been credited to Barry Briggs that he called him Sprouts after Sprouts Elder, who was one of the pioneers who rode pre-war, and that's where the Sprouts. I'm not even certain I've ever asked Ivan where it came from, but he was always being known to other riders, particularly international riders from the early days, as Sprouts. He was someone at the time I was working he came over in 63 for his second spell. I didn't know him at all back in the 50s when he was at Wimbledon and Eastbourne and Rye House, but he came over in 63 to join Mike Parker, who was promoter at Newcastle. Neither of us can remember the first time we actually met. But what I certainly remember is I was living in Diggs. I was working for a freelance agency in Burnley, which is probably, 20 miles from Manchester. I was also doing extracurricular work for Mike Parker and for Reg Fearman, some of their tracks. And I must admit, Ivan, first of all, at a meeting, but I know that his wife, Ray, when she discovered I was in Diggs, sort of said, well, come round for Sunday lunch. And I've told this story sort of quite regularly, but I went round for Sunday lunch and it was curry. It wasn't our traditional Sunday lunch. It was a lovely curry that Ivan lived in Upper Chorlton Road, which you could probably say it wasn't a slum area at that time, but it was a fairly downtrodden area of Manchester that Mike Parker, who, other than promoting Speedway and midget car racing in the late 50s, owned a number of properties, and he must have owned at least 3, and knowing Mike, he probably owned 53 or 73 houses in Upper Chorlton Road.
It's Ivan Major, I would say it would be fair to say, was probably Speedway's first international superstar. I mean, the things he did, the championships he won, John will have them all there ready for me, were quite amazing.
Yeah, that, obviously I think there were big names before. Like, you didn't get any bigger than Barry Briggs. He finished runner-up in the BBC Sports Personality of the Year competition. But I think Ivan took it all up to a different level. He was ultra professional, and he was probably the first rider who regularly took 2 bikes to a meeting. Until then it was literally the one bike strapped across the back of the car, and riders would drive in on that. There'd be a track spur, which if you hit trouble, they would ride the track spur or borrow pieces of equipment off it. But Ivan had his 2 bikes, and and also his whole, he was someone who trained with Manchester City. He was fit. He went out and rode a bike or ran every day. And while I think other riders were fit, I think Ivan took it to an extreme at that time. Nowadays, of course, every rider is an athlete. They're finely tuned athletes these days. But I think certainly on that score, and he won so much, didn't he? Probably his greatest achievement was winning the world title 3 times in a row in 3 different countries. Particularly his 1970 win in Poland, where British riders, when they'd been to Poland, had always struggled. It was a totally different scenario today when riders are racing there every weekend, so they know the Polish tracks. Poland has completely changed. Going back to 1970, it was still very much in the communist era. And he conquered all those sort of things. I don't think anyone really believed that he could possibly win a world final in Poland because it was so alien. But he did all that, and he won virtually everything, if not everything that there was. And transformed Speedway, and he transformed the clubs he was racing for.
He was a big favourite of my auntie as well. She was a big Ivan Major fan. You have the picture of him with the gold bite, the gold wheel, and all that as well. Loved all that.
Yeah, you see, all that was all part of it, wasn't it? That with my involvement with him, we actually had control of the photographs that were issued. Mike Patrick had an exclusivity to Ivan, that Ivan's contract, say with Exeter in the 70s, was that he had control over photographs. He had image rights, and that was totally unheard of for a rider. But all of that came through. He appeared on Desert Island Discs. He appeared on radio, on TV, and that was really, considering it was the late 60s, that Speedway had probably been at something of a peak in the the late 50s, but it came back in the late 60s, and I think Ivan led it.
Yep.
Yeah. Number 3, Ray Cresp. Again, an unusual choice. That Ray was a pretty decent Australian rider, quite successful over here. In 1965, he was riding for Long Eaton in the, what would it be, in the first year of the amalgamated leagues in the British League. I can only assume that I was talking to him for some reason at Long Eaton. And Pam and I got married on April the 24th, 1965. One reason we married then was that I'd been offered a job in London. Pam lived in Manchester. I'd lived in Liverpool, Burnley, in the north. So we decided to get married, but I was offered the job on the People, but that meant going down and living in London. The whole essence was that they wanted me to actually become the man in South Wales and the West Country. So I knew I was going to have to move to Cardiff, to be based with a former ITV commentator called Hugh Johns, who was quite a famous commentator of his day, and an ex-rugby player called Blethyn Williams, who were the two sports people covering South Wales, but I went as a news and investigative reporter. I must have been mentioning this to Ray and said, oh, I've got to go to London for a month or so to get into the system, to learn the styles and everything. So he said, oh, well, why, I've got a house, why don't you come, we'll rent your rooms, come and stay with us. So we did. So our first days of marriage were actually down living in a house in Crystal Palace that was owned by Ray and Marion Cresp. That it was a real sort of Speedway house, because the other lodger, it was divided into 3 floors, that Ray and Marion lived on one floor, we lived on another, and the other floor was a rider who I don't think any of you will know or remember, called Trevor Bloddick, or as some people would say, Trevor Blockdyke. He rode for Ipswich. He was South African. He rode for Ipswich, but he gave up Speedway to become a car racer, and was so successful he actually competed in Formula One Grand Prix. The couple of times, I think it was, in South Africa. But Trevor and his wife lived one floor, Ray and Marion in another floor, Pam and myself in the 3rd floor. And I'd go in by train from Crystal Palace. It was right next to Crystal Palace, with the big mast, the TV mast, etc. Only lived there for maybe 4 weeks or 5 weeks. But while I was commuting into town, into London, to the offices just off Fleet Street, Marion in particular was looking after Pam, who was, what would she be? She'd only been 20 at the time. Fond memories that, again, I'm glad to say that, Ray is still alive. Both Ray and Marion are still alive. So strangely, out of the majority of the team, I think it's 3 of them who are already in their 90s, and they're still alive. But owed a lot to Ray, because I could imagine, having at my age, a 20-year-old, trying to find somewhere to live for a month in London. Yeah. What an absolute godsend and a blessing to stay with the Speedway rider and his wife.
They talk about the Speedway family nowadays. We get this all the time on the show. The riders talk about how Speedway is one big family, but it sounds like it's nothing compared to what it used to be. I mean, Speedway riders becoming your landlord, are there when you need to move to London. Everybody just seemed to be part of each other's lives back then, or was that just you?
No, I think that applied. That 2 other stories on that. After I'd worked in Wales for the People, and then I was recalled to London in 1966, end of 66, that we then bought a house in a village called Stansted Mount Fitchard, which is actually where Stansted Airport is now. And the house we bought it because we knew a Speedway rider called Brian Davis, who rode for Hackney. And Brian had bought a house in the same village, and he said, oh, look, this is a new estate. Come and see our house. went to see their house, and we bought one, literally the next road to Brian. And I mean, also from that house, I can remember one night, Glasgow had been racing at King's Lynn, and they must have been racing somewhere else the following night. But literally, we had all 7 Glasgow riders stay with us that night on their way back. They were going from King's Lynn to somewhere, and they came and sort of dossed down on the floor. And that was the sort of thing we did. Like the first night that Pam and I were married, the first day, we stayed in a hotel at the Belfry in the Midlands on the Saturday night of getting married. The Sunday, we stayed with John Poyser, who was another rider at Hackney and Reading. And we literally stayed with them on the first full night of our married life, and then went down to London to stay at Ray Cresp. And that was the sort of your relationship you had with riders. Then riders would stay with each other. They wouldn't be going off to posh hotels or having to be at the airport at 6 in the morning. And they would often stay with each other. Like Jack Biggs, who was a famous rider, who was probably the unluckiest rider never to win a world final, for the simple reason he won his first 4 races, needed a point in his last race, and finished last. So he lost out on the world title. He got 12 points out of 15, but dropped 3 points in his last race when all he needed was a third. He lived with Colin Pratt's mum. And there are all stories like that your riders, it was a huge family, and they would stay with each other, they would travel together.
Well, that last story there, Peter, is perfect to introduce your number 4 rider. I don't know if you ever stayed with him or if he ever stayed with you, but you've described him as well as being unlucky not to be the second American world champion. Tell us who you've got at number 4.
Yeah, that's Scott Autry. That Scott came over, that Ivan had joined Exeter, and Exeter had been very much the unfashionable side, throughout the 60s and the first year or so of the 70s. That Ivan arrived, and Wally Maudsley and John Rich as the promoters wanted to have a successful team, and Ivan recommended. And at Exeter, I was team manager at the time, and we signed Scott Autry, who was this blonde surfer from California. Scott came over, averaged over 6, close to 7 points a meeting in his first season in Britain, and was a real pin-up. If you go onto social media today, Scott is on there virtually every day, and you can see how he was thought of, particularly by fans in Exeter, in Poole, where he later joined to ride for, and at Swindon in a year. He was a real sort of he was a Californian in many ways. I can remember we went over and for one of the World Finals or World Team Cup Finals, we went for a holiday in America, and we went out with Scott and his then wife Charlotte to a country club, literally, on the coast, and saw came this guy called Ricky Nelson, which I don't know whether probably you're all too young, but Ricky Nelson was a big star in his day, a singing star, and they were the sort of things that you did if you went to to an overseas meeting. You would spend time with them. We've spent time staying with Ollie Olsen and all sorts of people. But Scott, he was this American, but he was totally different to most of the Americans. He was quiet. He was reserved. He adapted totally to the UK life. He stayed to begin with, and for a lot of the time, with Neil Middleditch, with Ken and Bridget Middleditch at Bailey House down in Sturminster Marshall. But then he bought an old thatched cottage. So he lived, and he had a bulldog. So there he was, this sort of American that you used to see with a Stetson. He was living with an English bulldog in a cottage. He then later bought a sort of art gallery down in Cornwall. He adapted.
It's not what you expect a Speedway rider to do, really, is it?
No, none of it is, and particularly not an American Speedway rider.
Yeah.
Because Americans in those days were, without offending them, they were brash, weren't they? And they were loud. Like you always knew if you walked in anywhere, if there was an American in town, because you would hear him as soon as you stepped foot in the bar or in the restaurant, or whatever. But
I take it
right.
he did the business for Exeter as well, Peter, I take it.
Sorry?
I take it he did the business for Exeter when you signed him.
Absolutely, yeah. That he did it for Exeter, and he did it for Poole, and he did it for Swindon. At one stage, he ended the season, believe it or not, with a 10.80 average, from 36, 37 meetings, which was an absolutely phenomenal average. So he was top of the averages. And 1978 World Final, it was very much one of the favourites, to win it. But the story you can tell of him is that I think he had a chance of getting a second place runoff against Gordon Kennett if he won his last race, which he didn't. And instead he was one of 3 riders who finished on 11 points. Dave Jessup was one, and a Polish rider called Jerzy Rembas was the other one. 3 of them tied on points, a runoff for the bronze medal. Scott literally didn't want to go out for the runoff. He was absolutely as low as you could ever get. He said, I wanted to win the world title, but he's not interested in 3rd place. And I remember having to actually sit him down and talk to him. And just at the end of the conversation with Scott, if you forget about what might happen, but if you go out and get 3rd place overall, you can tell your grandsons in 30, 40 years' time, I was the 3rd best rider in the world in 1978. Scott has always said afterwards that was the only reason he went out to win it, because it suddenly struck him, yeah, that is the case. It is something. And I always think that I think he suffered because of Bruce Pennell coming along. And Scott should have been the next American world champion, but Bruce beat him to it. And I think that partly, I wouldn't say psychologically, I think that had an effect on him. And I think if Bruce hadn't won it, Scott could well have won it in the early 80s. But absolutely super rider, super bloke, lovely chap. You would always have him in your team. If you were picking a 7 to ride for any club, you would go for Scott Autry.
Brilliant. Well, we move on to number 5, Peter. So far, we've had an Englishman, a New Zealander, an American, and an Australian, and we're going back to Australia for number 5. Who have you got as your 5th member of your Super 7?
Yeah, I never really thought of that, but you're right, isn't it? It is quite a combination. Jack Duran. Now, Jack was someone I didn't really know until I moved down to Devon. As a family, we moved down to Devon to run Exeter. We moved to Devon in 1977, and I got to know Jack. We lived in a town called Dawlish, which is right on the coast, 12 miles from Exeter. That Jack and his wife Jan lived in a village next to the town called Dawlish Warren, which was a big holiday resort. And we got to know Jack and Jan really well. We'd go out in the evening for meals. But Jack, in 1977, I was involved in a project to introduce long track racing to Britain. And we got planning permission to build a 850 yard track at Holden Racecourse. And part of this project was not only the long track, but we also built a little speedway track, a little training track. And from 1980, when I became part owner of Exeter, We ran training schools on a Sunday, and Jack was the tutor. He'd finished it 2 world finals he'd been in. He has the unusual claim to fame that he was the only rider to beat Barry Briggs in any of the 4 years in which Briggo won the world title.
Yeah.
Barry, out of the 4 years, he got 15 points 3 times and got 14 in the other one. And the one rider to beat him was Jack Duran. So it shows, the class of him. He was an absolute great mates with Streety. He and Neil.
Peter, I read that in 1955, Jack Duran never missed a single league match and never scored less than 11 points in a match. Is that right?
I have no idea. I'll take your word for it. But,
yeah. Apparently, he never missed one league match. He never missed a single match that year and never scored less than 11 points. And I mean, that is some feat when you consider the competition he would have been up against back in.
Absolutely. Well, I really should have been able to come out with that and you'd have been impressed. Yeah, I said, I don't really remember Jack riding, but he is a lovely, lovely man. But as I say, he and Streety, the famous story Jack tells is that how he and Streety used to share a bed when they first joined Exeter in the 50s. That they just slept together for no untoward reason, but it's the way it was in those days. A couple of blokes could share a bed without worrying about them. But Jack,
John, these are the stories that we don't get from today's riders.
No, absolutely. But Jack,
and I'll tell you what, I know there's a brilliant story coming up with your number 6 as well, which I cannot wait for you to tell. We're going to stay in Australia. And we've got a 3 times world champion, although I don't think we'll be talking about that after this story. Who do you have at number 6?
Well, number 6 is he's not really an Australian because he was born in England, so we claim him as English. It's Jason Crump. That's in 1977, I got involved with Phil, with his father Phil, who again was a great rider, 3rd in the world, Australian, won the World Team Cup with Australia. But Crumpy, the older Crumpy Phil, wasn't the best organised rider in the world. He had an enormous heart. He was an absolute crowd pleaser, never stopped trying, but he was a little bit disorganised in one way in particular, and that was in his travel. So I became more or less his travel consultant. I would book for when he raced abroad a lot on the Sundays on the long tracks in Germany and the rest of Europe. And I began booking all Crumpy's travel arrangements, booking the ferry, doing the deal with the German promoter for his appearance fee. And so we became sort of pretty close friends in that sense. That one evening, they must have been, he and his then wife must have been coming down, just for us to talk about something. And I can always remember, or at least my daughter can always remember, who was about 11 at the time, we had a kitchen, we had a house which overlooked the town of Dawlish and overlooked the sea. And we had a great big picture window in the kitchen, a table in the kitchen with a couple of 4 chairs probably. And we can always remember Jason, who was just over 1 at the time, was sat on the chair without a nappy. And of course, what happened? I'm sure you can all guess. He decided he had to go for a tinkle. I can remember that Sarah, who was 11 at the time, was absolutely aghast that there was this little baby weeing all over the chair in the kitchen. So it's always been hard for me to sort of, picture Crumpy anything other than that. And then
there was a chance of booking Crumpy on the Super 7 then.
Does he still speak to you, Peter?
Sorry?
Does he still speak to you, and will he still speak to you after this?
I'm not sure if he will after this. You know? I'm not even sure if he knows the story. But he became, you know, obviously he grew up. James Easter and myself took over or revived Peterborough in 1992. One of our first signings was Jason. The only reason Jason actually wanted to go and ride for Exeter. You know, his granddad, Neil Street, lived in Exeter. So he wanted to stay with Neil and ride for Exeter, but Exeter turned him down because they thought that because he was an Australian, they thought that he'd come in on, I think it was a 7-point average then, that James and myself both knew that he's born in Bristol, had a British passport, had a British license, so would come in as a 2-point average. So we signed him as a 16-17-year-old in 1992 on a 2-point average. I think he ended that first season with an 8-point average. Some years later, 1996, when I was running Exeter on my own, 96 was the second year of the amalgamation when all the clubs joined together, that we wanted a number one. You know, we signed Jason for £30,000 from Paul. That was in 1996. Sarah, my daughter, you know, still jokes about us saying, you, instead of you spending, you know, 30 grand on Jason, you know, you could have left it me for a diamond ring or something. But, you know, Sarah and Jason always got on well. You know, he always confided in different things with her. He was a super rider from day one. He was a terrific rider and he just got better and better and better. He was someone who never gave any trouble. He'd occasionally give you a little bit of, you know, grief on a race night, but you could guarantee the following morning Jason would be on the phone just to say, hey boss, I was out of order last night. We've remained friendly ever since. I still, you know, I still talk to him. I've been in contact with him earlier today. I was very, very slightly involved in joining Plymouth this year, just in so much that I suggested to Mark Phillips, the Plymouth promoter, look, why don't you ask Jason Crump if he'll ride in the championship? It just went from there, and sure enough, he's back. He, you know, he always gave so much, didn't he, to Speedway. He had that side of his dad, a lot shrewder in many ways than his father, a lot more organised than his father. A super, super rider. It was just such a shame that his career was cut a little bit shorter by that nasty arm injury that he had. But always have Jason in the team. I'm sure that I think a lot of people will have him in the Super 7.
Yeah, and we're going to finish off that Super 7, Peter, with your last rider. He's another one that's a 3 times world champion. Who are you completing your Super 7 with?
It's got to be Buffy, hasn't it? Ty Wuffenden. As you know, I've had a lot of dealings with Ty, that I sort of collaborated on his autobiography. We worked on that together for quite a long time. I'd also, at one time I was Great Britain under-21 manager, and you know, called Ty up for his international debut. Yeah, I think he's a rider who can go on to, you know, to win at least several, if not a lot more, world championships.
Peter, knowing Ty as you do, and you've obviously got a better insight into him than many people because you've worked on his autobiography with him. What is it about him that makes him special? What makes Ty stand out from the rest?
He's a workaholic. He's a workaholic in everything he does now, and that includes the racing side. You know, he didn't used to be. You know, he, by his own admission, as you know, he was a party animal, but he changed, and he put so much effort into it. He's got an incredible mentality that a lot of the riders that I know who've been very successful were very self-centered, little bit introverted. You know, they needed to be focused and in the zone when it came to the big night. Somebody like Ivan, no one outside could ever talk to Ivan during never mind a world final, during world final week. You know, he would shut himself off. He'd be totally focused. Whereas, you know, Ty, I think what summed up Ty was the crash he had at Torren, if you remember, when he came off the track, and was just, you know, it was as if he'd been, you know, playing with a sandcastle or something when he came back into the pits. You know, any other rider I'd known, you would have been so uptight about that, but Ty wasn't. You know, he just lets it all soak over him. But you know, no one should confuse that as a weakness. That is a strength. That is one of his total strengths. I think you know, Darcy Ward, who was talking about it, and said how strong he is mentally, and he is hugely strong. He's got a lot of Ivan in him, you know, on that mental aspect. That Ty knows that he can be, and often is, the best rider in the world. And it's just a total inner strength. He was an absolute dream to work with on the autobiography. He was always available. You never ever got to say, oh, I don't feel like it. And you know, some days, you know, we'd spend literally 8-9 hours, you know, together, you know, working on it and chatting. And you know, he was just such a, you would have found him a dream to work with, Liam. That
Yeah.
you know, there are some people, it's hard work.
Yeah.
You're getting them to open up, but Ty is a completely open book. You know, but what
you need to talk him into doing his Super 7 for us,
Yeah.
Peter.
Have you asked him?
We're going to. So tell him how nice we are.
That's what you
It'd
need.
be a good start if we actually asked the boy.
You just need to ask him, don't you? Like
We're too shy. We're too
I
shy.
can't remember Ty actually turning down any chance of publicising Speedway, because he wants Speedway to be successful.
He's one of the few riders you've ever seen on BBC and things like that as well, in the news and these morning programmes and things. He's on there with the bike when he won the third world title and things like that. So you're right, he's definitely a good ambassador for the sport.
Yeah, I've never known him turn down stuff. Like, obviously sometimes you have to turn it down because you have family commitments or you have other things that you can't make it. But if he's been free, I've never known. Like he'd get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to go and appear on breakfast time on the BBC, to not only to promote himself but to promote the sport. And I always think that it's an absolute shame that British Speedway didn't use him when they should have done. You know, in 2013, after he became world champion, they should have been getting him on in every magazine in the country, on every radio show. But as far as I'm aware, you know, and I can only take what Ty has said, nothing was done. They never tried anything, you know, to get him to promote. Anything that was done by BSI. Great sadness, because he would be a tremendous ambassador. You know, he's a man of the age, isn't he? He's got, you know, his tattoos. You know, he's down there with the kids and everything, and he would be a super ambassador of the sport if only he'd been used. So, yeah, and I felt very, I'm not going to say honoured, but I was proud that he actually asked me if I would do the book for him. You know, he asked me at, I think it was King's Lynn, when I'd gone over to watch King's Lynn, and I think it must have been against Wolverhampton. And he said, and I can remember him sort of saying to me, he said, "Oh, will you write my autobiography?" And to be honest, I took no notice of it. I thought, well, you know, he doesn't want sort of an old age pensioner writing his autobiography. So probably did nothing about it. And then a couple of months later, he asked again. And my grandson's heavily involved in Speedway via Monster, and you're great mates with Ty. They used to sort of spend nights out together up in Sheffield when, you know, Josh was at uni. And I said to Josh, I said, "Do you think Ty really means it? And he says, yeah, he means it. So we got together, we found a publisher, and found a very good publisher, a mainstream publisher, and away we went. And we're now working on additional chapters for a paperback, which is a bit of an exclusive for you.
Yay!
There will be late in the year, depending that it doesn't change because of COVID, there will be a paperback edition of Raw Speed.
Brilliant.
So tell me then, Peter, you've got all these amazing riders together. What name would you give your team?
Oh. The corny one would say, call them the Liverpool Chads, wouldn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll go with that.
How that would go down.
Who would be the team manager, Peter? Who would hold this 7 together in your experience in the Speedway world? You're allowed to say yourself.
No, yeah, I wouldn't. I don't. If they're my team, I wouldn't team manage them. I always had a thing that when I was promoter of or owner of a club, that I would never do the team managing, and always had a team manager. Who would I have? If I was going for the best, I would probably go for Peter Adams.
He's been mentioned on here a few times. Yeah, he's obviously very popular.
Yeah. Peter is a superb team manager. So it would probably, if I was going for who would I have if it was a total red? Who would like to get involved, but I'm not sure how he would do the job. Would be Brigo. I'd like to get Barry involved some way. Barry would obviously be in a 7 if it was going on ability and record and whatever. But I would say Barry and Pete Adams, with Pete Adams doing all the hard work and Brigo just fronting up.
And who would be your captain, your team captain?
Oh, no doubt, Ivan. Such a brilliant captain that he offers so much more to the team than anyone else I've ever known. That which might surprise a lot of people think that Ivan is very much, was very much Ivan, but he wasn't. He wanted to win. It's really like all really good riders who are happy in their own skin. They want the team to win. Like Ty, for example, desperately wants Great Britain to win gold medals. He really does. And no matter what any people might think from outside, that is one of his ambitions, to get up there and to receive the OV Funding Cup or whatever it is now from Speedway Pensions, for Great Britain. But 100% I'd go for Ivan.
Peter, you've got heat 15 then. You're needing a 5-1 for victory. Who are the 2 riders that go out and secure that 5-1 for you?
Ivan is one. I'd have been tempted to say Scott, because when we're at Exeter, they probably had more Heat 13 5-1s than any other pairing around. But I would go for Ivan and Ty.
Guys, we've got sorry Peter, just to cut you off. We've got less than 5 minutes now, so we'll just quickly do the 10 questions. We'll fire through them. So just quick answers, and then we'll need to wrap it up from there. So we'll start kind of now. Liam, if you want to introduce the quick fire question.
Okay, Peter, as we're heading towards the end of the show, let's hit you with 10 quick fire questions. When was the last time you were on a Speedway bike?
I think it would have been 2009 or whatever, on a victory parade at Coventry, I would have thought.
Do you ever have a lucky or favourite helmet colour?
No, but I'll go for green.
Is it a gate number?
Is
it a gate number that you like your riders to go from?
No, it would all depend. That at Coventry, I always had a guy called Dave Rowbottom who would record which riders got out at the start. a lot of people would record, you know, the gate positions of the rider who won the heat, but Dave always did it for me on the rider who got into the first turn. So I'd ask Dave, what has been the best gate for us tonight?
Tea or coffee?
Tea, but very, very weak. I have the weakest tea imaginable.
Okay, if the question normally is if you'd not been a Speedway rider, if you'd not been involved in Speedway, I imagine you would have tried to be a journalist. But what would you?
I don't know whether to be offended by that, Liam. I tried to be a journalist. Oh, right.
I'm assuming you would.
I certainly know who to send down next time.
If you hadn't been a journalist involved in Speedway, he said, undigging hopefully very quickly, what would you have been? What other occupation would have attracted you?
I don't think there is one. That as a schoolboy, I wanted to be a journalist. I've been fortunate enough to live the life of a journalist. I've done almost everything in journalism, from investigative, news reporting, feature writing, show business writing, TV writing, and in latterly days, since 1977, sports writing. So, you're a journalist, and it is the best life imaginable, isn't it?
You get paid for doing your hobby, which I think brings us on to the next question, John.
What's your favourite pastime or hobby, Peter?
Watching Liverpool win. Football, of course.
And your favourite film?
I'm not a great film man. The film that I haven't seen and I want to, and I think it might be my favourite, On Any Sunday. I've seen clips of it on YouTube, but I've never sat through it. So because that's got Speedway in it, I'd probably say On Any Sunday.
Do you prefer
Once a jolly swag man, another one to see.
No, I was there for that almost.
And that's another story.
Do you prefer a race suit or a race jacket, Peter?
Race suit. I still can't. Okay.
Worst thing about Speedway, Peter?
You've got to say rain-offs, haven't you, and the lack of promotion.
And the best thing about Speedway?
4 riders, flat out.
Yep.
You see one race, it's absolutely a magical moment in sport.
Yep.
It's a minute of sheer exhilaration and excitement.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. Peter, it's been fascinating talking to you. You've opened my world up a bit to riders. There's some I hadn't heard of, some I'm delighted to have heard of, and we could do this interview probably 4 or 5 times over with the amount of riders that you've seen, and we appreciate you doing it. Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure. A real pleasure.
Yeah. We'll be back soon with another edition of Super 7, where we might actually ask a Speedway rider this time if he could tell us his favourite 1 to 7 is Super 7. From Liam and myself, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for watching.